In 1848, when John Jacob Astor died in his Manhattan mansion, he was worth $20 million, roughly $700 million in today's money. The newspapers called him the landlord of New York. Politicians attended his funeral. Presidents sought his counsel. Nobody mentioned the opium. Nobody mentioned the thousands of Chinese addicts who had funded his real estate empire. Nobody mentioned the ships that sailed into Canton harbor loaded with Turkish drug contraband, or the young men in coastal villages who traded their futures for the next pipe. That part of the story got buried, quietly, efficiently, the way only truly powerful families can bury things. This is not the story of a rags-to-riches immigrant who built America's first great fortune through hard work and vision. That version exists. It's taught in schools, repeated in biographies, printed in history books. This is the other version, the one where a butcher's son from a German village figured out that the fastest road to American wealth ran straight through human suffering, where empire was built not on genius alone, but on poison, exploitation, and a willingness to look away. This is how the Astors did it, and what it cost. Johann Jacob Astor was born on July 17, 1763, in the village of Waldorf in the German state of Baden-Württemberg. It was a small place, a few hundred souls, a church, fields that stretched flat toward the horizon. His father, Jacob Astor, was a butcher, not a prosperous one, the kind who worked from before dawn and still went to bed uncertain about tomorrow. There was nothing in Waldorf that promised greatness. There was no inherited land, no family connections to merchants or nobles, no accumulated capital waiting to be deployed. What there was, in abundance, was the grinding pressure of poverty, the particular hunger that comes not from starving, but from watching the world stratify around you and understanding, clearly, that you are on the wrong side of it. Johann Jacob watched his father cut meat for people who would never invite him to dinner. He learned early what it meant to serve, and he decided, with the cold clarity that sometimes visits the children of the poor, that he would not spend his life doing it. His older brother George had already left for London. Another brother, Henry, had gone to America. The family was dispersing across the Atlantic world, each one chasing some version of escape. Johann Jacob followed George to London in 1779, at 16 years old, working in a musical instrument business, making and selling flutes. It was honest work. It was also slow. He arrived in New York in 1784, 20 years old, with almost nothing. 7 years old as a nation, America was loud and chaotic and electric with possibility. He carried a few pounds sterling and a small stock of musical instruments. He spoke heavily accented English and knew almost no one. Within months, he had pivoted entirely. The musical instruments faded. Furs took their place. The fur trade was the engine of early American commerce, beaver pelts especially, which the European hat industry consumed voraciously. Astor began small, buying pelts from trappers and reselling them to merchants, learning the pricing rhythms and the seasonal logic of the market. He made trips into the frontier himself, understanding the trade from the inside, building relationships with Native American trappers that would become the foundation of a continental operation. He was relentless, not in the inspirational sense that biographies prefer, the hard-working immigrant with a dream, but in the mechanical sense. He identified inefficiencies and eliminated them. He undercut competitors until they folded, then absorbed their networks. He extended credit when useful and called it when necessary. He remembered every number and forgot no slight. By the mid-1790s, John Jacob Astor, he had anglicized his name, as immigrants do, was the most important fur merchant in New York. His pelts moved through Montreal, through London, through Leipzig. He understood international commerce at a moment when most American businessmen were thinking locally. But he was thinking about something else entirely, something larger. The fur trade had made him comfortable. What he wanted was a different category of wealth, the kind that didn't depend on the availability of beaver populations or the moods of European hat markets. What he needed was a commodity with guaranteed demand, controlled supply, and enormous margins. He found it by looking west. Not into the American frontier this time, but across the Pacific, toward China. The Canton trading system had been operating since the 1750s, and a handful of American merchants had discovered something extraordinary about it. China would accept American goods, furs, ginseng, sandalwood, and pay for them with the things Americans desperately wanted: silk, porcelain, and tea. The margins were unlike anything available in domestic trade. A ship that left Boston with $50,000 in cargo could return with goods worth 10 times that amount. Astor studied the China trade the way he studied everything, methodically, from the outside, until he understood it well enough to move inside. He began making his first forays into the Pacific trade in the mid-1790s, sending ships west with mixed cargoes, learning the rhythms of Canton, the preferences of the Hong merchants who controlled access to the Chinese market. He was not yet the dominant force he would become. That would require something more. Something that the respectable fur merchants and Boston Brahmin traders were reluctant to touch. It would require opium. But before he could reach that point, he needed to understand the full geometry of the Canton system, its rules, its players, its vulnerabilities, and he needed something else entirely, a government willing to look the other way. In both cases, John Jacob Astor would prove remarkably fortunate. The Pearl River Delta in the early 19th century was the most valuable trading corridor in the world. Ships from Britain, America, Holland, and a dozen smaller nations crowded its waters between September and March, the trading season when the monsoon winds allowed passage. They anchored at Whampoa, 12 miles downstream from Canton, because foreign vessels were not permitted to proceed further. The rules were clear, enforced by the Qing dynasty with the particular confidence of an empire that considered itself the center of civilized life. Foreign merchants could trade. They could not live permanently in China. They could not learn the Chinese language formally. They could not bring weapons into the factories, the narrow strip of waterfront warehouses where they conducted business. They dealt exclusively through licensed Chinese merchants called the Kohong, a guild of 13 firms whose principals were among the wealthiest men in Asia. To Western eyes, the system was frustrating. To John Jacob Astor, it was an opportunity. The Canton system had a structural problem that everyone saw and no one wanted to say aloud. China made things that the West wanted desperately: silk, porcelain, tea, especially tea. Britain was consuming tea at a rate that transferred enormous quantities of silver out of the British Empire and into Chinese coffers. The trade balance was catastrophic for London, simply inconvenient for the Americans. But the fundamental issue was the same. China didn't particularly want what the West was selling. American ginseng had a market. Sea otter furs from the Pacific Northwest had a market. But these commodities had natural limits. Ginseng grew in specific regions. Sea otters were being hunted toward extinction. The China trade needed a commodity with reliable supply, guaranteed demand, and margins that could sustain the enormous cost of a 6-month Pacific voyage. The British East India Company had already solved this problem by 1800. The solution was opium, Bengal opium, grown in the Ganges Plain under East India Company supervision, was finding its way to China in quantities that grew every decade. The company itself couldn't sell it directly in China. That would have been an official violation of Qing prohibition. So, it auctioned the drug in Calcutta to private traders who took it the rest of the way. These men were called country traders. They operate in a profitable grey zone, technically independent of the company, while being entirely dependent on its production infrastructure. The opium reached China through a network of receiving ships anchored off the coast at Lintin Island, well outside Canton's formal trading zone. Chinese smugglers, working with the complicity of underpaid local officials, moved the drug from Lintin to the mainland. The Kohong merchants, who dominated legitimate trade, often had financial interests in this parallel system. The entire arrangement was universally understood and universally denied. John Jacob Astor was watching all of this. He was building his American fur company, expanding his continental operations, but the China numbers were pulling at him. He began corresponding with partners in Canton, developing his own intelligence network about what moved and at what prices. His entry into the opium trade came through Turkish sources rather than Indian ones. The American merchants who moved into the drug business found an angle that the British hadn't fully exploited. Turkish opium from the Smyrna region of present-day Turkey was chemically different from Bengal opium, slightly less potent, differently flavored, but it was available to American traders who had no access to the East India Company's Bengal supply chain. Smyrna opium became the American drug of choice for the China market. Ships would load in Turkey, sail around the Cape of Good Hope, or through the new Suez Corridor, and deliver to the Lintin receiving ships. The profits were extraordinary. A chest of Smyrna opium purchased for $15 in Turkey could sell for $60 to $75 in China. A single successful voyage could return 200 to 400% on investment. Astor's involvement was careful and characteristically indirect. He didn't advertise his participation. His ships carried mixed cargoes, furs, sandalwood, ginseng, and the opium was listed in manifests with the particular vagueness that accountants learn to provide when their employers have reason to prefer it. The paper trail that survives is incomplete by design. What is documented is the outcome. Between 1800 and 1820, Astor's China trade generated returns that his domestic fur business, for all its scale, could not match. The money flowed back to New York and immediately went somewhere safer, couldn't be seized or taxed or embarrassed out of existence. It went into Manhattan real estate. But Astor was not operating in isolation. The opium trade that enriched him was enriching an entire generation of American merchant families simultaneously. The Perkins family of Boston was perhaps more deeply involved. Thomas Perkins ran an operation that was essentially an American opium enterprise with some legitimate trade on the side. The Cushings, the Forbeses, the Delanos, Franklin Roosevelt's maternal ancestors, all had China trade fortunes with varying degrees of opium involvement. What Astor understood, perhaps more clearly than any of them, was that the China profits needed to be converted into something permanent. Ships sank, trade routes closed, governments changed policies. Land in a growing city was different. Land appreciated regardless of what you had done to acquire it. The Pearl River Delta was, in these years, beginning to show signs of what the opium trade was actually doing to Chinese society. The drug had arrived as an elite indulgence. Wealthy merchants and officials used it recreationally, and the quantities consumed were manageable enough that the Qing court's periodic prohibitions felt more theoretical than urgent. By 1820, that was changing. The trade had moved downstream, from elite consumers to working people, dock workers, porters, soldiers. The social profile of addiction was shifting from occasional vice to systematic dependency. Villages in Guangdong province reported that entire working populations were compromised. Men who had been reliable agricultural laborers now spending their earnings on the next pipe. Families fractured, children going hungry. The Qing government saw this clearly. What it couldn't figure out was how to stop it, because the infrastructure of the trade had become too embedded, too many officials bribed, too many coastal merchants dependent on it, too many foreign governments protecting their traders. And those foreign governments were protecting them very deliberately. In Washington, the China trade lobby was a real political force. Merchants like Astor cultivated relationships with politicians who could ensure that American diplomacy never became an obstacle to commercial opportunity. The State Department received detailed letters from China traders explaining the situation and explaining why American commercial rights in Canton needed to be protected, even when the nature of the trade was left artfully vague. Astor himself was in regular contact with presidents. He lent money to the federal government during the War of 1812, when the Treasury was desperate and Astor was one of the few men in America with sufficient liquid capital to matter. That kind of relationship bought a lot of administrative discretion. The Canton system was generating extraordinary wealth for a small group of American families. It was also creating a public health catastrophe of historic proportions in China. These two facts existed simultaneously, and the men profiting from the first fact had every incentive to not think too carefully about the second. John Jacob Astor was not unique in this. He was, however, more systematic about converting the proceeds than almost anyone else. While other China traders enjoyed the wealth, he was already planning its transformation from liquid capital derived from drug sales into the most permanent, most respectable, most American asset imaginable. The streets and blocks and lots of New York City were being assembled beneath his feet, and he was buying them. The mechanics of the opium trade were not mysterious. They were, in fact, embarrassingly straightforward for an operation that would eventually destabilize the most populous nation on earth. It began with cultivation. In the Smyrna region of western Anatolia, present-day Turkey, opium poppies had been farmed for centuries. The climate was suited to it. The locals understood the agricultural rhythms. American merchants who entered this market in the early 1800s didn't need to create a supply chain from scratch. They needed to connect an existing one to a new customer. Perkins and Company of Boston was the first major American firm to operate the Smyrna-Canton route systematically, beginning around 1805. John Jacob Astor's operations followed a similar pattern through intermediaries and partnerships rather than direct firm involvement, a characteristic indirection that kept his name off the most uncomfortable documents, while ensuring his accounts received their share of the profits. A typical voyage worked like this. An American merchant vessel would arrive in Smyrna, modern Izmir, in the spring. The ship's captain or supercargo would work with local agents to purchase opium chests, each weighing roughly 140 pounds and packed with raw opium paste processed from poppy harvests. The price varied by season and harvest quality, but throughout the early decades of the trade, American buyers were paying between $12 and $20 per chest in Smyrna for product that would sell for 5 to 6 times that amount in China. The voyage from Smyrna to Canton took between 4 and 6 months, depending on the route. Most American ships went around the Cape of Good Hope, stopping at ports along the East African and Indian Ocean coasts. Others went east through the Mediterranean to Suez, then overland, then by ship again. The choice of route involved calculations about speed, safety, and which colonial officials along the way were most likely to create difficulties, and how much those difficulties could be resolved through the universal currency of bribes. Arriving in Chinese waters, the ships did not proceed directly to Canton. They anchored at Linton Island, a rocky outcrop in the Pearl River estuary, about 40 miles south of the trading factories. Linton was where the system revealed its true architecture, receiving ships, old hulks, permanently anchored there, accepted delivery of the drug from incoming vessels. The opium transferred from fast American clippers to these floating warehouses, where it waited to be collected by Chinese distributors. The distributors were fast boat operators, working in networks controlled by a hierarchy of middlemen that extended from the coastal smugglers all the way up through the distribution system to urban dealers. The boats that collected from Linton were typically armed. The business attracted competition, and competition in this context meant pirates, and manned by crews who operated with an efficiency born of serious financial incentive. Payment flowed back through the same system in reverse. Chinese silver, converted from the drug money that had passed through multiple hands, made its way to the receiving ships and then onto the American vessels. The Americans were getting what they needed: silver and bills of exchange that could be converted in Canton, and the Linton system meant that technically, from the perspective of the Canton factories and the Kohong merchants, nothing improper had occurred. The opium never passed through the legitimate trading zone. The formal ledgers remained clean. Inside Canton, the American merchants maintained their respectable positions. They attended the formal trading sessions, negotiated tea contracts, purchased silk bales, drank tea with Hong merchant partners who were quite possibly financially involved in the same drug network at the other end. The discretion was mutual and professionally maintained. John Jacob Astor's precise role in this machinery has been obscured by time and by the particular diligence with which wealthy families manage historical records. What is clear is that his China trade partnerships and investments generated returns that are inconsistent with legitimate commodity trading alone. The fur and ginseng markets he participated in were competitive and margin compressed. The extraordinary profits that were flowing into his Manhattan real estate purchases in the first 2 decades of the 19th century require another explanation. The historian John Upton Terrell, examining Astor's financial records in the 1960s, calculated that during the peak years of the China trade, Astor's annual returns from Pacific commerce averaged somewhere between 30 and 50%. Returns that simply didn't exist in the legitimate trade he was officially conducting. Something else was supplementing the books. Terrell was diplomatic about naming it. The financial logic was not what the opium profits were doing in Astor's hands was something remarkable. They were being laundered through the most systematic real estate acquisition program that New York had ever seen. Manhattan in the early 1800s was a city in the middle of a growth explosion. The population was doubling every decade. The grid plan commissioned in 1811 was laying out the streets of a city that didn't yet exist north of Houston Street, preparing avenues and blocks for the hundreds of thousands of people who were going to arrive from Europe over the next 50 years. Anyone who understood what was coming and had capital to deploy was looking at an asset acquisition opportunity with no precedent in American history. Astor understood what was coming. He bought land the way other men bought furniture, functionally, systematically, without sentiment. He concentrated on Manhattan's Lower West Side, purchasing lots and blocks in areas that were currently marginal but lay directly in the path of northward expansion. He bought from desperate sellers and patient ones. At auction and through private negotiation, he rarely sold. Selling was for people who didn't understand what they had. The specific mechanism of conversion was elegant in its simplicity. Opium profits arrived as silver or bills of exchange through Astor's China trade accounts. These were converted to dollars and deployed into real estate purchases through a web of holding arrangements and private transactions that were entirely legal, entirely unremarkable by the standards of the day, and entirely effective at obscuring the origin of the capital. By 1820, Astor owned significant portions of what would become some of Manhattan's most valuable neighborhoods. By 1830, the appreciation on those early purchases had already multiplied his original investment several times over. The drug money had become building, money had become land, money had become, over the decades that followed, something so thoroughly legitimized by time and transaction that its origins were simply irrelevant. Meanwhile, in China, the consequences of the trade that had funded all of this were becoming impossible to ignore. The Qing government's internal reports from the 1820s describe a crisis that reads, across 2 centuries, with terrible familiarity. Provinces that had once been agriculturally productive were reporting significant portions of their working-age male populations lost to addiction. The bureaucracy was compromised. Officials who were supposed to enforce the prohibition were taking bribes from distributors, and officials who genuinely tried to enforce it found the smuggling networks too embedded to disrupt without dismantling entire systems of coastal governance. The economic consequences were severe. Silver that should have been circulating in the Chinese economy was flowing out. Reversed, the trade balance that had once favored China now working against it, as drug imports consumed the silver that had previously flowed in for tea and silk. The Qing dynasty was watching its monetary system being hollowed out by a commodity it had explicitly prohibited, imported by foreigners who operated under the protection of their home governments. The human cost existed in parallel with the economic one. Addiction is not an abstraction. In the villages of Guangdong and Fujian provinces, in the working districts of Canton itself, in the ports and river towns where the distribution networks terminated, the opium trade expressed itself in destroyed families, neglected children, men who had traded their functional lives for the particular mercy of the pipe, the American merchants who were profiting from this, Astor, the Perkins family, the Cushings, the Delanos, the Forbeses, were not unaware of what their product was doing. Canton was a small expatriate community. Information circulated. The Chinese merchants they dealt with were not shy about the social problems the trade was creating. The missionary community that had established itself in the region was producing reports, letters, and eventually books describing the situation in detail. What the American merchants chose, collectively, was not to engage with this information in any way that affected their commercial behavior. This wasn't unusual. The cotton economy of the American South was doing something comparable to a different group of human beings at exactly the same moment, and the northern merchants who profited from cotton finance, many of them the same families involved in the China trade, had similarly well-developed mechanisms for moral compartmentalization. What is specific to Astor, and what makes his story distinctive, is the scale of what he did with the money afterward. The opium profits didn't simply enrich him. They became the foundation of an institution, a family dynasty, a Manhattan land empire, a social position that would shape American life for more than a century. The Astor family name would go on to fund libraries, hotels, and charitable foundations. Waldorf-Astoria hotels would host presidents and kings. the Astor fortune would flow into the social establishment of Gilded Age New York, endow arts institutions, and produce the kind of philanthropic legacy that eventually displaces public memory of how the money was first made. But in the 1820s, that transformation was still in the future. What existed was a German butcher's son sitting in a Manhattan mansion, watching his land values rise, and counting profits from a commodity that was destroying Chinese society one village at a time. He was not finished yet. By 1825, John Jacob Astor had built 3 interlocking empires, and most people could only see one of them. The visible empire was the American Fur Company, chartered in 1808, with the full support of the New York State Legislature and the implicit blessing of President Jefferson. It was continental in scope, with trading posts stretching from the Great Lakes to the Pacific, employing thousands of trappers, voyageurs, and clerks in a logistical network that covered more geographic territory than most European nations. The American Fur Company was Astor's public face, the story he told, the enterprise he allowed historians to examine. The second empire was the China trade, conducted through partnerships and intermediaries, with the careful indirection of a man who understood that certain commercial activities were better described in general terms than specific ones. This empire existed in account books and ship manifests, and letters between trusted partners, the kind of documentation that could be read with different conclusions depending on the reader's disposition. The third empire was real estate, and it was the one that would outlast everything else. Astor's Manhattan acquisition strategy followed a logic that seems obvious in retrospect and was almost invisible to his contemporaries. The city's population in 1820 was approximately 123,000 people. It would reach 312,000 by 1840, 515,000 by 1850, and continue on an upward trajectory that wouldn't plateau until the middle of the 20th century. Every one of those people needed to live somewhere. Every one of those residences needed to sit on land. And the land was finite. What Astor grasped, and grasped earlier and more completely than anyone around him, was that in a growing island city, land was not just a store of value. It was an inexorably appreciating one. You didn't need to do anything with it, except hold it. The city would grow around your lots, fill in the empty blocks, extend the streets, and simply make your holdings more valuable through the sheer pressure of human population. Moving northward, through a geographically constrained space, he held everything he bought and leased rather than sold. This was the key discipline that separated Astor from every other wealthy man of his era who dabbled in real estate. Others bought lots and sold them when prices rose, capturing the current profit, releasing the future one. Astor kept everything. He leased properties on 21-year terms, collecting rents while retaining ownership of the underlying land. When leases expired, he renewed them at market rates, which by then were substantially higher than at the previous renewal. The compounding was relentless. The capital that fueled this acquisition program required a continuous infusion of liquid cash, the kind that came from high-margin commerce rather than from businesses that had to reinvest in themselves to grow. The fur trade was profitable but capital-intensive. The China trade, in its opium dimension, was simply extraordinary. Profit margins that would fund a single additional land purchase from the fur business would fund a dozen from the China trade. In 1825, the Erie Canal opened, connecting the Great Lakes to New York Harbor. Astor had seen it coming. He had positioned himself in real estate that would benefit from the commercial explosion the canal would trigger. the massive increase in goods flowing through New York, the corresponding increase in population, the accelerating pressure on Manhattan's land supply. The canal's opening was, in a sense, the moment when Astor's real estate thesis became visible to everyone else. By then, he had been acting on it for 20 years. His Manhattan holdings by the mid-1820s formed a map of the city's future. He owned significant land on the Lower West Side, large portions of what would become the valuable commercial strips of Broadway and Greenwich Village, and properties scattered across the middle portions of the island whose value would multiply as the city grew northward. He had purchased Aaron Burr's estate, Richmond Hill, in 1803, and immediately subdivided and leased it. He had acquired tracts from struggling farmers in what was then the rural Upper Manhattan, understanding that eventually the city would consume everything. He did not stop. The profits from Pacific commerce kept arriving. They kept moving into land. The real estate empire was self-reinforcing. Rising rents generated cash that funded new purchases, which generated more rents. By the early 1830s, Astor's wealth was growing faster than any active business enterprise could explain. The money was multiplying from the land itself. The American Fur Company, meanwhile, was beginning to show its limits. The fur trade was ecologically finite. You could only trap so many beavers before the supply collapsed. European fashion was also shifting, moving away from beaver felt towards silk hats that would eventually make the entire industry obsolete. Astor saw this clearly and made a decision that was, in retrospect, one of the most financially sophisticated in American business history. He sold his fur interests in 1834, near the peak of the market, before the decline became obvious to his competitors. This freed his remaining attention entirely for real estate and for the careful management of his social position, a project that was, in its own way, as deliberate as anything he had done commercially. The Astor family was building a public identity. His son, William Backhouse Astor, was being positioned to inherit and expand the real estate empire. His daughter Dorothea had married into the Langdon family, connecting the Astors to old New England money. The family attended the right churches, appeared at the right social events, donated to visible charitable causes. Astor himself understood that the legitimacy of a fortune depends less on its origins than on its visible deployment. He funded Astor House, which opened in 1836 as the most luxurious hotel in America. 6 stories, 309 rooms, running water on every floor, the kind of establishment that attracted exactly the class of people whose opinions about the Astor family Astor most wanted to shape. He also funded the Astor Library, which he endowed with $400,000 before his death, and which would eventually become part of the New York public library system. The library was a masterpiece of reputation management. A man who builds a library is a man who believes in knowledge and culture and the improvement of public life. The source of the money that funds the library is, by the time the marble is laid and the books are shelved, beside the point. The Chinese communities that had been devastated by the opium trade did not have historians in New York writing their story. The addiction that had hollowed out Guangdong villages was not a subject discussed at Astor House dinner tables. The silver that had flowed from Chinese consumers through distribution networks, through the Lintin, receiving ships and back to American merchant accounts, and from those accounts into Manhattan real estate, was now simply capital, legitimate and settled. In China, the 1830s were bringing the trade's consequences to a crisis point. The Qing government's commissioner Lin Zexu was appointed in 1838 specifically to end the opium trade, with imperial authorization to use whatever means were necessary. He was not a subtle man. He wrote directly to Queen Victoria, explaining in patient and reasonable terms that Britain was poisoning China and asking her to stop. The letter was ignored. Lin's response was to confiscate and destroy more than 1,000 tons of opium belonging to British and American merchants, dissolving it in saltwater trenches and flushing it into the Pearl River estuary. The destruction was theatrically complete and practically significant. It represented an enormous amount of money. The British government used it as justification for war. The First Opium War began in 1839 and ended in 1842 with the Treaty of Nanking, which was a disaster for China measured in almost any dimension. Hong Kong ceded to Britain. 5 treaty ports opened to foreign trade. An indemnity of 21 million silver dollars paid to compensate the very merchants whose drugs had been destroyed. The opium trade legalized in all but name. For American merchants, the outcome was ambiguous. They were not formal parties to the British war, but they benefited from the opened ports that the British victory secured. The commercial infrastructure that the guns and treaties had established was open to everyone. By 1839, Astor was 76 years old, largely retired from active commerce, and enormously wealthy in a way that had become thoroughly self-sustaining. He didn't need to do anything. The rents arrived. The land appreciated. The social position consolidated. He had done something extraordinary. He had taken capital generated by one of history's most destructive trades and converted it, through the mechanism of real estate in a growing city, into a fortune that would look, to all subsequent observers, like the simple reward of American commercial genius. The story of the Astor fortune's human cost has 2 chapters. One takes place in China. The other takes place on the streets of New York City, in the tenement buildings that the Astor family owned and maintained, or rather, did not maintain, for the better part of a century. Both chapters begin with the same source: the money that John Jacob Astor extracted from the opium trade and invested in Manhattan real estate. The connection between these 2 geographically distant human disasters runs through a single account ledger and a family's determination to never look too carefully at either. In China, the consequences of the Anglo-American opium trade are now reasonably well documented by historians who have spent the last several decades recovering a story that Western historiography spent an equal period either minimizing or ignoring. The numbers are stark. Opium imports into China grew from approximately 4,000 chests annually in 1800 to more than 40,000 chests by 1838, by the time Commissioner Lin Zexu was making his dramatic bonfire of foreign narcotics. Somewhere between 2 million and 10 million Chinese people. Estimates vary widely, but the scale is not in doubt, were addicted to the drug. What addiction meant, in practical terms, for a Guangdong province farm family in the 1830s was a specific kind of catastrophe. The family's working adults, typically the men, though women were not exempt, would spend income on opium that had previously gone to food, children's welfare, and agricultural investment. Farms went untended. Children went hungry. The social infrastructure of village life, which depended on reliable participation from its working members, began to crack. The medical consequences were long-term and brutal. Opium dependency in the 19th century, without any of the treatment infrastructure we have today, was effectively a life sentence. The drug rewired the brain's reward system with a thoroughness that meant life. Without it became physiologically intolerable. The symptoms of withdrawal, vomiting, seizures, bone pain, psychological anguish were severe enough that most addicts couldn't tolerate them. returning to the drug not from weakness of character, but from the simple imperative of biological survival. Into this situation sailed the merchants who supplied the drug, the Americans involved, Astor's network, the Perkins organization, the Forbes and Cushing families, were not, in the main, cruel men by the standards of their society. They were businessmen who had made a calculation that remains familiar, that the suffering their product caused was happening at a sufficient geographic and cultural distance that it didn't need to enter their moral accounting. The distance was important. You couldn't visit Astor's Manhattan office and see Chinese addicts. You could see his library, his hotel, his real estate developments, the charitable contributions his family was beginning to make to New York institutions. The geography of the trade's benefits and the trade's costs was perfectly arranged to prevent their simultaneous observation. The second chapter of the blood money story is closer and, in some ways, more damning for that reason. Astor's Manhattan real estate empire was not composed of gracious townhouses occupied by the comfortable middle class. It was, substantially, composed of tenements occupied by waves of arriving immigrants, Irish fleeing the famine of the 1840s, Germans fleeing the failed revolutions of 1848, and later Southern and Eastern Europeans drawn by the promise of American industrial employment. These people had no options. They arrived with nothing and needed somewhere to live, and the somewheres available to them were the lower Manhattan tenements that families like the Astors owned. The conditions in these buildings were, by any standard that matters, appalling. Tenement housing in mid-19th century New York was organized around the extraction of maximum rent from minimum space. Buildings designed for one family were subdivided to hold 6 or 8. Rooms without windows housed sleeping families. Ventilation was non-existent in interior spaces. Sanitation infrastructure, toilets, running water, was minimal or absent. Basement apartments flooded regularly. Disease moved through the buildings with terrible efficiency because the density made isolation of sick residents practically impossible. The Astor family was aware of this. It was not possible in the 1850s and 1860s and beyond to be the largest residential landlord in Manhattan and be unaware of tenement conditions. Reformers were writing about it. Newspapers covered it. The city's health inspectors produced reports. Jacob Astor would eventually photograph it with unflinching specificity and publish those photographs in a book. How the Other Half Lives. 1890, that shocked middle-class readers who had somehow managed not to see what existed a few blocks from their own addresses. The Astor family's response to all of this was essentially nothing. The buildings were not improved beyond what legal minimum standards required, which were themselves minimal. Rents were collected with consistency. Lease terms were enforced. The properties were maintained at the level of functionality necessary to prevent tenants from having legal grounds for rent refusal. William Backhouse Astor, who inherited the empire from his father and expanded it substantially through the 1850s and 1860s, became specifically identified in public discourse as a slumlord, a man who collected rent from the poorest New Yorkers while spending as little as possible on the living conditions those rents were supposed to provide. He was among the wealthiest men in America and among the most notoriously cheap in his obligations to his tenants. His son, John Jacob Astor III, inherited the same empire and the same reputation. The newspapers of the 1870s and 1880s wrote about the Astor tenements with a critical specificity that contrasted sharply with the family's social position. They were simultaneously the grandest names in New York society and the most exploitative of New York's poorest residents. The arithmetic was not complicated. The Astor rental income in the 1870s was estimated at between $1.5 and $2 million annually. The tenants paying those rents were among the most economically vulnerable people in the city. Recent immigrants, day laborers, domestic servants, the working poor who had no alternative. The buildings they were paying for were not receiving equivalent investment. The money flow looked, in structural terms, remarkably similar to what it had looked like a generation earlier in China. A captive population with no realistic alternative was paying Astor money for something they couldn't refuse to need. The profits were accumulating in the family's accounts. The living conditions of the people generating those profits were not the family's concern. This parallel was not invisible to contemporaries. Reform literature of the 1870s and 1880s occasionally made the connection explicit that the grandeur of Astor's social position rested, directly and undeniably, on the degradation of the people who were paying the rents that sustained it. But the connection to the China trade origins was rarely made, partly because it required knowledge of commercial history that was already being forgotten, and partly because the two catastrophes, the Chinese addiction crisis and the New York tenement crisis, seemed so entirely disconnected to anyone who hadn't followed the money. The money, of course, connected them completely. Meanwhile, the Astor family's philanthropic expenditures were growing. The Astor Library expanded. Family members donated to hospitals, to cultural institutions, to civic projects. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, the Mrs. Astor, arbiter of the 400, who defined New York's social establishment in the Gilded Age, spent extraordinary amounts on the social rituals of upper-class life, on balls and dinners, and the maintenance of a position that required constant theatrical reinforcement. The philanthropic spending was real. It was also, in the context of the income being generated from tenements and inherited opium money, modest, and it served a function that the Astor family understood intuitively, even if they never articulated it. Public generosity redefines a family's public identity. The library matters more than the tenement. The hospital wing gets the plaque. The building full of sick immigrants in an Astor building on the Lower East Side does not. What is striking, looking at the Astor story across its full arc, is how effectively this transformation was accomplished. By the time of Caroline Astor's social dominance in the 1880s and 1890s, the family's origins were already remote enough to be merely interesting rather than damning. The opium trade was history. The tenements were contemporary and documented, but the family's social position was strong enough to absorb criticism without structural damage. In 1890, when Jacob Richest published his photographs and essays about New York tenement life, the Astor buildings appeared in the documentation. The response from the family was the same as it had always been. Minimal adjustment, continued collection, maximum retention of income. John Jacob Astor IV, the great-great-grandson of the original, would die on the Titanic in 1912, the richest man aboard a ship full of wealthy people. His death was romantic in the way that Gilded Age disasters often were, tragic, cinematic, the stuff of memorials and newspaper tributes. By that point, the Astor name meant something that had entirely lost its connection to the drug trade that had made it. But the money was the same money. The fortune that went down with the Titanic and the much larger fortune that remained on land, in Manhattan real estate and investments, descended from the profits of a trade that had addicted millions of Chinese people and extracted their silver to fund land purchases in a growing city whose poorest residents would then be exploited for additional decades. The line from the Canton opium houses to the Titanic first-class passenger manifest is direct. It runs through ledger books and ship manifests and real estate records and inheritance documents. It is documented, traceable, and, in the polite literature of American business history, almost entirely unmentioned. The making of a dynasty requires more than money. It requires a story, a version of origin that the family tells, that their social peers accept, that eventually becomes the version that historians record and textbooks repeat. The Astors understood this intuitively, and they constructed their narrative with the same systematic thoroughness that John Jacob Astor had applied to his land acquisition program. The story went like this. A poor immigrant from Germany, armed with nothing but ambition and intelligence, built the first great American fortune through the fur trade and shrewd real estate investment. He proved that America was different from Europe, that birth didn't determine destiny, that a butcher's son could die richer than any aristocrat his homeland produced. It was the American dream in its commercial form, and it was not false. It was simply incomplete. The incompleteness was the point. A story that included the opium trade was a different story, one about exploitation rather than enterprise, about using human suffering as a commercial input rather than building something from nothing. That story was available to anyone who looked carefully at the evidence. The Astor family ensured, through a combination of social dominance and selective historical memory, that almost no one did. The dynasty that emerged from the original fortune followed a trajectory common to American plutocratic families. The first generation makes the money, the second generation consolidates and expands it, the third generation learns to perform social position, and by the fourth and fifth generations, the money is so thoroughly institutionalized that its origins are archaeological. William Backhouse Astor, the second generation, doubled or tripled his inheritance through the same real estate strategy his father had established. He was not a man of great imagination or social warmth. Contemporary accounts describe him as cold, precise, and entirely focused on the management of his wealth. He expanded his Manhattan holdings northward into the new neighborhoods that were filling with the incoming immigrant populations. He built the kind of buildings that poor people could afford and maintained them at the minimum standard that would keep them paying. He also began the social ascent that would define the family's next phase. He married Margaret Rebecca Armstrong, connecting the Astors to an established American family with colonial roots. The marriage moved the Astors from the category of new money, always a slightly uncomfortable designation in a society that claimed to disdain class, into something more settled. Their children would be born into a family that had been wealthy for 2 generations, which was, in mid-19th century New York, beginning to constitute old money. The third generation produced John Jacob Astor III, who managed the fortune conservatively and watched it grow through real estate appreciation rather than active commercial enterprise. He was more philanthropically active than his father, and his public profile was shaped by donations to institutions rather than by business journalism about tenement conditions. He married Charlotte Augusta Gibbs and had 2 sons, William Waldorf-Astoria and John Jacob Astor IV. These 2 sons would represent the dynasty's peak in American public life, and their divergence would illustrate the ways in which great fortunes, by the time they reach the 3rd and 4th generation, have become things unto themselves, institutions that exist independently of any individual and that shape their inheritors as much as the inheritors shape them. William Waldorf-Astor was the eldest son, born in 1848. and by the conventions of the era, he was the primary heir. He grew up in a world of extraordinary privilege, private tutors, European travel, the kind of social formation that required no effort because it was simply the environment. He went into politics briefly, serving in the New York State Assembly and failing in 2 bids for Congress. He found American public life unsatisfying, partly because in America, even great wealth didn't insulate you from the obligation of justifying yourself to voters. In 1890, he moved to England. He bought Cliveden, a great country estate in Buckinghamshire. He bought Hever Castle, the childhood home of Anne Boleyn. He endowed institutions, built hotels, the Waldorf on Fifth Avenue, eventually combined with his cousin's neighboring Astoria into the Waldorf-Astoria, and spent his final decades pursuing the aristocratic status that American democracy had refused him. In 1917, the British government made him Viscount Astor. He had completed the journey that the opium money had begun, from a German village to the British peerage, in 3 generations. His cousin Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, wife of William Backhouse Astor Jr., was doing something parallel on the American side, though she was building social rather than political aristocracy. Mrs. Astor, as she was universally known in New York's upper circles, became the defining figure of Gilded Age American society. Her ballroom at 350 Fifth Avenue held 400 people comfortably. The guest list for her annual ball became, informally, the official register of New York's social elite. If you were on Mrs. Astor's list, you were in. If you weren't, no amount of money could entirely compensate for the absence. The famous 400, the number who fit in Mrs. Astor's ballroom, was both a social gatekeeping mechanism and a piece of mythology. Ward McAllister, her social lieutenant, used the number to explain why New York society was so selective. The actual logic was more interesting. Mrs. Astor was determining who counted as a member of the American aristocracy, and the standard was not simply wealth, but wealth of the right kind, held for the right period, deployed in the right ways. The Astor family, in this formulation, was obviously among the elect. They had been rich for 3 generations. They had funded institutions. They had married into established families. They had performed the rituals of philanthropic generosity that distinguished old money from new. The fact that the original money came from opium, a detail that would have been uncomfortable to discuss at Mrs. Astor's dinner table, was simply not part of the social accounting. The dynasty's last great figure in American life was John Jacob Astor IV. Born 1864, the son of William Backhouse Astor Jr. and Caroline Schermerhorn, he was everything the dynasty had been building toward. Educated at St. Paul's School and Harvard, handsome and socially polished, the inheritor of a fortune so large and so thoroughly embedded in Manhattan's fabric that it was essentially beyond individual comprehension, he was also, in his way, genuinely accomplished. He wrote a science fiction novel, A Journey in Other Worlds, published in 1894, that imagined interplanetary travel, and was earnestly received by a reading public that found the idea charming, coming from a man who could afford to build the actual spacecraft if someone figured out how. He held patents on inventions, including improvements to bicycle brakes and pneumatic road improvements. He invested in the Astoria Hotel, which became part of the Waldorf-Astoria complex. He married and divorced Ava Lowell Willing, a scandal in an era when divorce among the upper class was still considered shocking, and then, at 47, married Madeline Force, who was 18. The age difference attracted exactly the kind of attention that Astor's social position was supposed to protect against, and the couple decided to spend time in Europe until the gossip moderated. They were returning from that European trip on the Titanic when the ship struck an iceberg on the night of April 14, 1912. John Jacob Astor IV died in the sinking. His new wife, 5 months pregnant, survived. He was worth approximately $87 million at the time of his death, roughly $7 billion in today's currency. He was 47 years old. His estate would have been larger, except that he had been distributing portions of it into trust structures that his lawyers had been constructing for years. The Titanic disaster produced a specific kind of cultural processing. The ship became a symbol of hubris and class, and the fragility of the very wealthy, and Astor's death was a centerpiece of that symbolism. He was the richest man who died on the ship, and his death was given a gallantry that may or may not have been accurate. Accounts of his conduct in the hours before the sinking vary, but was certainly desired by the family and the press. The fortune continued past his death. His son, Vincent Astor, inherited the bulk of it and administered the real estate empire through the first half of the 20th century, gradually liquidating properties and shifting the fortune toward philanthropy and public service. Vincent's wife, Brooke Astor, became one of the most celebrated philanthropists in New York history, eventually dying at 105 in 2007. The Astor name associated in the public imagination almost entirely with charitable giving, and here the transformation is complete. Brooke Astor, generous, elegant, beloved by New York's cultural establishment, is the image that remains when people think of the Astor family at the end of the 20th century. The Astor who funded libraries, the Astor who supported the poor, the Astor who gave back. The giving back was real. Brooke Astor's were genuine and substantial, and they benefited New York in ways that are documented and appreciated. None of this is in question. What is also real, and what the charitable legacy cannot undo, is the origin. The money that funded Brooke Astor's philanthropy descended through 4 generations of inheritance and real estate appreciation from capital that John Jacob Astor accumulated through a combination of the fur trade and the China opium commerce. The Chinese villages where opium addiction had destroyed families in the 1820s and 1830s did not receive Astor charitable gifts. The New York immigrants who had lived in Astor tenements in the 1860s and 1870s were not compensated for conditions their rents had generated. History doesn't work that way. Fortunes don't get returned. The people harmed are dead, their descendants unidentified and uncounted, the suffering dissolved into the general record of the past. What history can do is name things accurately. The Astor fortune was not simply the reward of commercial genius applied in a dynamic economy. It was the product of commercial genius applied to a specific set of opportunities, some of which involved participating in, or profiting from, the systematic addiction of millions of people in a country too far away to complain effectively. The dynasty this built, the hotels and libraries and social position and Titanic myths and Gilded Age balls and philanthropic legacies rose from that foundation. Understanding the foundation doesn't erase what was built above it, but it changes what we're looking at when we admire the structure. America's first great family fortune began with a boy watching his father butcher animals in a German village. It passed through the opium networks of the Pearl River Delta. It settled into the grid of Manhattan streets and grew for a century without anyone needing to think about how it started. That's how dynasties work. Not through the erasure of the past, but through the patient accumulation of a present that makes the past seem irrelevant. John Jacob Astor died on March 29, 1848. He was 84 years old. He left an estate of approximately $20 million, the largest private fortune in American history to that point. His will provided for the Astor Library. It provided for his family. It provided for a few modest charitable bequests. It did not mention China. It did not mention opium. It did not mention the thousands of people across 2 continents whose lives had been made worse so that his could be made better. Fortunes rarely do.